Sorry to interrupt you. Somebody's asked, will you be sharing the slideshow afterwards?
Yes, certainly can do, and it will be recorded as well and put on our YouTube channel. Yep.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this project kicked off a little while ago, thanks, as I said earlier, to the funding from the Alex Ferry Foundation. And the idea was that much has been written and said about Fair Work in Scotland, but one of the things that hadn't been done is to get a broader view of Fair Work, and in particular seek the views of union reps on Fair Work in Scotland. So that was the aim of this particular project. As an introduction, what the paper covers is the concept that the Scottish Government wants a Fair Work nation by 2025. So the paper examines the Fair Work Initiative, how we got there. It looks at the impact on working lives as far as we can tell in Scotland. It takes the experiences of union reps and views from across Scotland from a variety of civic society and other organisations who have expressed a view, and makes some recommendations as to how we might achieve the goal of a Fair Work nation by 2025, and also has a toolkit which is now in a separate document as well, which I've expanded on that, which can be used on trade union and other courses and training. So firstly, a bit of history, particularly for those perhaps not as familiar as those of us who have been involved in this for a long time. The journey to Fair Work really started with devolution, when the then Scottish Government, Scottish Executive as it was in those days, signed a memorandum of understanding with the STUC, which exists to this day, and it indicated a different approach to industrial relations. Early indications of that were the NHS Partnership Agreement, work on the Scottish Living Wage and procurement, and that led to a couple of bigger reviews, one called the Working Together Review, chaired by Jim Mather, and the Christie Commission, chaired by the former General Secretary of the STUC, Campbell Christie. That all moved on to the Fair Work Initiative in 2015, and then some very practical bits like the Fair Work First procurement policy in 2018. And the Scottish Government also included Fair Work in its broader economic strategies. In particular, there are national performance indicators, which have a range of Fair Work elements to it, including now collective bargaining. In parallel to that, there was a thing called the Scottish Business Pledge, which is a sort of voluntary thing that businesses can sign up to. It's not been very successful, to be honest. I point to a very low take up and frankly little sign of any activity when you visit their website. The Fair Work Convention has been very busy. It has a Fair Work Action Plan. It's had a number of sector inquiries, and it's pushed the Scottish Government to extend the procurement requirements. Scottish Government's inward investment strategy has also made a requirement on the real living wage, but only the real living wage. Nothing else is really referenced in their strategies. And of course, the inward investment to Scotland is very rarely in the hard to reach areas where low pay is more prevalent. I put a chapter in about working life in Scotland because, and that really shows there has been in Scotland, particularly in comparison with the rest of the UK, very significant progress on the living wage. But other factors such as low pay more generally, poor working conditions and effective voice are still very prevalent within Scotland. It's very difficult to make a linkage to whether Fair Work has been a factor in any of these, positive or negative, probably positive, except for the living wage, where I think we can make some reasonable linkages. I also highlight a range of studies done by the organisation listed there in their analysis of working life in Scotland. One of the problems we have in Scotland is that there is quite a lot of UK data on the workforce, but very little in Scotland, or very little which is drilled down to Scotland, and that there is not, frankly, very good or very very overly averaged out given the size of the country and the unequal size of the nations within the UK. But nonetheless, we can see some fairly common problems when we look at the range of issues that these reports have raised. Problems of mental health, overwork in the CIPD report. Citizens Advice Scotland, I think, is interesting, their report on Fair Work, because they often cover the hard-to-reach groups, the non-unionised areas, and they highlight low incomes and unfair conditions. The Westminster Scottish Affairs Committee has also did a report highlighting insecure work, which is higher in Scotland than the rest of the UK. By that, I mean concepts like 0 hours contracts. The Learning Work Institute highlighted again pay improvement in Scotland, but again, trade union membership and insecure work hasn't moved, still fairly pretty much as it was back in 2015. The Carnegie Trust did a lot of work on the pandemic, and like in other areas, highlighted that the pandemic only exacerbated factors already there. I refer to Creative Scotland's report because this is one of the more challenging sectors, and it covers the more broad concerns that the voluntary sector has covered in a recent report by Patricia Findlay for the Glasgow Association Voluntary Sector, which talks about funding as being a barrier to implementing fair work, but not just funding, there are other factors as well. IPPR Scotland highlighted again insecure work. And there have been a wide variety of trade union campaigns I highlight in the paper, which invoke fair work, but recognise there's been a mixed response to those issues. I think it's also important to highlight that not everybody is impacted equally, particularly women, young people, and those with protected characteristics are more likely to suffer from low pay, poor working conditions, or the lack of an effective voice in the workplace. So the survey of trade union representatives was done by a variety of different ways, focus groups, online, in person. And there was a very high degree of consistency. Frankly, after I'd done about a third of the interviews, essentially there was really no change after that, and you got a very clear picture of people's understanding of fair work in Scotland. And I'd summarise that as good recognition in the public sector, pretty good recognition, only slightly less in the voluntary sector, but not very much in the private sector. Although, in fairness, there weren't many responses because it really wasn't seen as an issue there. Most of the reps had some limited knowledge of what fair work actually was, and very few had done much updating. A third had used fair work, usually defensively in negotiations. So and I listed a range of things that they'd used before, not always successfully, but very often successfully, particularly, I have to say, in terms of recognition and insecure work and getting the real living wage. What many reps, however, highlighted was limited managerial awareness, particularly when you got below the top level, when you got down to middle managers and below. And that was true even in the public sector, where the awareness was greater the closer you were to central government and less the further away in the Quango sector or in local government. Reps were pretty clear about the changes they thought were required. Unsurprisingly, greater publicity and awareness, clarity about what fair work actually was, other than the living wage, which was measurable and that they understood. They particularly felt it ought to be applied more rigorously. The phrase "needs more teeth" was very common, and that they want to see that through legislation and enforcement. And they also would like to see their own trade unions produce more resources in the training, etc., as to how they could more effectively use fair work. So, in a sentence, essentially, reps were very supportive of fair work, but need more information, guidance, and stronger enforcement. So making work more effective, what I've done there is essentially done a summary of a whole range of reports, which I won't go through, but you can read them in there. A number of organisations in Scotland have highlighted, and I've pulled in some international work and some work in England from the TUC and others, highlighting what they think makes fair work, or the Welsh government, for example, calls it decent work, would make it more effective. And from that, I've highlighted 19 recommendations, which I've grouped in this slide. Essentially, I think there's a need to clarify what fair work looks like, almost what the outcomes look like. It's the criticism very often from a wide range of organisations is that other than the real living wage, it's all a bit vague about what we actually mean. The words sound good, but what does that look like? What does a fair work employer look like? And I think examples of how we might get there, if you look at the NHS's PIN policies, which are a wide range of good examples of good employment practice, and a national workforce framework, particularly for the public service. And I mean by that not just the public sector, but including the voluntary sector and other providers of public services. This is a proposal included in a previous Reid Foundation paper taken up by a number of trade unions in various submissions. There should be a common framework across the public service. I think before 2025, there's a need to refresh the principles and put a laser focus on the hard to reach sectors. A lot of the engagement with fair work tends to be from employers who are already decent or good employers, and less so from the hard to reach sectors like hospitality, construction, care, and childcare. The Scottish Government seems reluctant, I'm not sure why really, to name and shame poor employment practice. Even the UK government's happy to name and shame people prosecuted for not paying their national minimum wage, the so-called living wage. So I think there was a strong view, I have to say, particularly from trade union respondents, that needs to happen. But the big call, I suppose, is strengthen collective bargaining. And that really means using the procurement leverages that the Scottish Government has got. And in some sectors, that's very strong, like the care sector, like childcare. In other areas, probably construction as well, given the number of government capital projects, but probably less so in the hospitality sector. I think there's also a call to widen Fair Work First. This is a procurement initiative. Certainly a greater weighting on the fair work elements of contract evaluation, better monitoring. Very often contracts are awarded and nobody looks to see if it's still happening. And I think that would be helped by having a proper evaluation tool to make it easier for public sector bodies to do that. I also argue that the Scottish Government use all its levers. At the moment, it tends to use procurement, but it doesn't use much in the skills area or education. Doesn't use much in its wide-ranging enterprise network with lots of grants and financial support. The Scottish Investment Bank is obviously at the higher level of that, nor does it use it in its incentives, its tax benefits, like the small business bonus in business rates. And it could use other incentives to essentially to prioritise those employers who are fair work employers, and some accreditation might make that easier. I've talked about labour market data. I've also feel that health and safety, and I think the work of Scottish Hazards is important here. I highlight that in the report. The health and safety is a bit of an afterthought in the current principles. I think it should be more explicit, as should more on flexible working. And I think there needs to be more focus on those who are allegedly self-employed. So there's a high degree of poverty in that group. And I'm not just talking about the bogus self-employed, but even those that are properly self-employed. I don't duck the issue of developing the case for devolving employment law either. I think there's a strong case for doing that. The problem, however, is that nobody, and I mean the Scottish Government, the trade union movement, all the people who are in favour of devolving employment law, very few have actually spelt out what they mean by that. You know, employment law is not a simple matter of definition. There are a wide range of factors, including discrimination law, health and safety, and others. And nobody's really done any work to define what that is. So I explain that in the paper and discuss what more needs to be done there. In terms of using Fair Work, this is where the separate booklet that I've done on for union reps is involved. I highlight the current resources, which are not extensive, but they do exist. There's a Fair Work employer support tool, which could be done by reps with employers. There's a self-assessment tool for employees, which is a bit limited, but it's there. The CIPD have an extensive range of resources, admittedly written from an employer perspective, but nonetheless they are supportive of Fair Work and often a useful source of information. And of course, there are trade union guides, not specifically on Fair Work, which is one of the reasons for us doing this project. But there are aspects of Fair Work, and reps can incorporate some of those checklists and other work in their own work. So in the guide, I've essentially is aimed at helping union reps understand Fair Work and publicise it. I give a suggestion of a number of survey questions they might want to ask members. I haven't done it as a fixed thing because I think different employer organisations will have different approaches to that, but I hope the questions there are helpful. Then I suggest a joint evaluation with the employer. This is something that ought to be done quite straightforwardly in the public sector at least. Establishing a common position as to where the organisation is and agreeing an action plan to become a more effective Fair Work employer. If the employer is resistant, then I suggest ways that the union can do its own assessment, how it can collect data which might measure how fair a particular employer is, and then identify the levers which might be used to push the employer to do Fair Work more effectively, or at all in some cases. Finally, in conclusion, I essentially say a broad political consensus in Scotland that poor work has had negative outcomes, and I emphasise that's actually a fairly broad political consensus as well. Even the Scottish Conservatives don't have quite the same position as the UK Conservatives on these issues. Fair Work has certainly helped, but poor work remains in Scotland. And essentially what we need to do is to change the employment culture. Unions support Fair Work, but they want more action. And that, I hope, is reflected in the recommendations. And there's a small chart I put there on the right graphic to describe that. My conclusion essentially is those three sentences: that the largely voluntary approach taken to Scotland's Fair Work initiative has made limited but positive contribution to improving working lives, particularly in the broader public services. However, it has not yet delivered major results, as evidenced by the continued prevalence of poor quality work across Scotland's labour market. If Scotland is to claim to be a fair work nation in 2025, much more needs to be done to turn the worthy ambition into reality. I'll close that down, Mike. Get us back to the thing.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was brief, to the point, but very, very important.